Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I'm going to sort of just introduce this exhibition briefly. This is really a part of something much larger that we did in Calcutta in 2017 of December. So I'll give you the reasons, the rationale behind the exhibition, how we decided to do it, and what the themes were in framing the exhibition. So I worked at the Centre for Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta, which has had a fairly long tradition of collecting personal familial documents, personal archives, digitizing them, and then returning the original to the owner. We also have a lack of space, so we have, over the last 20 years, we built up a purely digital archive. The focus of the digital archive was normally Bengal. It's an Eastern India centric collection. The collection normally tends to reflect on artistic production, visual cultural practices, and it's been very extensively used by filmmakers, scholars, academics, etc. So when we chanced upon a slightly unusual collection, when we had a fairly eminent family of Eastern Bengal, now Bangladesh, this family, which was a family of very illustrious scholars and musicians and invested in public culture like theatre, national education, and which also happened to be very, very interested not just in practicing music but in representing music. This family, the most important protagonist of the family is Birendra Kishore Roy Chaudhary, who we called the scholar musician because he's both a musician and a scholar, and whose private collection was sort of going to waste. It seems as though his daughter tells me, who is a very dear friend and a well-wisher of the centre, she tells me that a lot of the collection had got lost. Some of them had been turned over to garbage. Some of them had been stolen over time because nobody really cared. And so what we have now is really 2/3 of the collection. But she made it over to us and we decided to digitize it. And as I was trying to write an academic catalogue for the collection, I realized two things. I realized its extreme diversity. So it was a very diverse and a very eclectic collection. And I was also determined, because it was a music-related collection, I did not want it to be confined to the attention of scholars sitting in a dusty library or an archive. And sometimes the microfilms will work, sometimes you don't get access. I did not want to leave it at that. So in many ways, my whole concern was to open up the archive to both students, scholars, enthusiasts, but also to musicians. In many ways, therefore, I was expanding the stakeholder for the collection. So that was one of the reasons why I chose to do this as an exhibition. I did a catalogue. I have a fairly detailed catalogue of the material, which is available online, but I felt that I needed to sort of put it out there, and I thought the best way to do it was to put together an exhibition. Just a word about the collection. The collection is primarily textual. It is in 3 languages. You have bulk of it is in Bangla. It's vernacular. Both his writing, the material he collected right from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, what he wrote, what he reminisced, a lot of notebooks that actually contain his musical training, teaching, compositions, marginalia, quite fascinating. There's a lot of stuff in English, some in Hindi, and probably one of the best collections of music-related journals. I mean, we've got things from the 1870s, 80s, one particular journal which I think is invaluable for the cultural history of the entire city, which we have continuing to digitize. So this is a very eclectic collection. We also had images. So we have photographs, we have images. So we felt that there was a possibility of using the collection to put it out there. Then when we started reading the material more carefully with 2 students of mine who've been extremely helpful, and of course with a lot of attention given to us by music enthusiasts in the city, it really gained a lot of traction. We realized that there was a very interesting story that we could tell through the collection. I don't want to sound as though this is the only theme that can emerge from the collection. It's the way we conceptualized it. And it's of course free for people to read it as they will. So for me, the two protagonists for this particular exhibition were one, of course, the scholar musician himself. He's at the center of the collection in every way. The other protagonists which I felt needed to be foregrounded were the Seni Ustads. So we felt that we had to talk about this man who had learned enormously, very privileged, and also his location gave him access to extraordinary talim. It's not something which anybody could have gained. It was a particular location in a particular princely state and his networks in the city that gave him access to this diversity of talim. But what made him unusual was the fact that he wanted to disseminate it to a much larger public, and what made him remarkable was the real intimacy that he enjoyed with his teachers. So it gives, his work and reflection gave a very different spin on the legacy of the Ustads that we have, and which tends to be written out of the way we write our national history of music. So there is always, even in Bengal, a tendency, for instance, Surendra Mohan Tagore, another very important patron, talks about Hindu music. So there's a way in which music is represented in somewhat reductive, even communal categories. So we felt this was time to at least put that bias out there and see what this man had to say, both in terms of what he had learned, what he said in public, and what he wrote, both in private and in public. So that was sort of the conceptual rationale for me putting this exhibition and staging it in this particular way. One other addition I'd like to add, his cousin, his elder cousin on the maternal side, Bimala Kanto Roy Choudhury, another remarkable figure in the history of Bengal, because here is a man who is also a trained musician, played the sitar, learned, has a very, very long connection with the Vilayat Khan family, a trained magician. So here is an extraordinary collection, again, waiting there to be digitized and brought out to the public. But we thought, at least for the moment, we would digitally integrate Birendra Kishore's collection with Bimala Kanto's collection. So in a sense, we were also playing with how we create our own archive, we create a fixity, and then we also break it apart. So it was important for us intellectually to engage with all of this. So as I said, at the core of the project and at the core of the exhibition is this man, flanked by his father, who is also a great enthusiast, a theatre person, a music person with extensive networks, and his elder cousin, whom we thought really sort of embody a particular moment in the history of Hindustani music in Bengal through partition, through independence, and through the 50s and the 60s. So that was by way of sort of introducing the collection. I did forget to mention in the morning that we also have some elements of the exhibition in Bengali. So parts of the panel were bilingual because so much of the material was in Bangla. We felt it was important to reach out to a vernacular audience. Ideally, we had thought of the entire exhibition to be bilingual, but we did not have the space to generate that sort of, generate these panels. So coming to the Senis, I do just want to give you a few sort of tips to maybe factor in the depth of this particular phenomena in Hindustani music. You know, as the name indicates, they are descendants of Mian Tansen, the legendary court musician of Akbar. Descendants on both the daughter's side and on the son's side. The two sides, the daughter and the son, tend to be associated with bean playing and the rabab playing. So you have the beankar and the rababiyas, both of whom trace their origin to Mian Tansen. You also have those who learn with Seni teachers and therefore claim to be descendants in terms of discipleship. So when I use the word Seni, I am talking about those families that had direct access to Tansen's descendants or direct access to his teaching, and Seni teaching is deeply valued as talim. They are associated with Dhrupad singing, they are associated with certain aesthetic values that go on to make Seni music. Now, why are the Senis important for us? Post-mutiny of 1857, a number of very eminent musicians, both who were in Rampur and in Lucknow in particular, come to Calcutta. the very historical trajectory of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, who is deposed in Lucknow, brought to Calcutta, where he creates what he calls Chota Lucknow in Metiaburs with all these remarkable musicians who come and set up court. So in many ways, Bengal in 1857 is exposed to this really invaluable Seni Talim right from 1857 that is then received by the Bengali middle class, that learns it, that passionately collects it, that represents it, and that experiments with it. So there is a definite historical context to the proliferation of instrumental music in Bengal. It's like a historical, it's part of a larger historical process that we talk about. Now, these Senis are really valued by the Bengali gentry, by the zamindars, and who are then given extensive patronage by men like Birendra Kishore's father, but also by other zamindars. So you have Maiman Singh, you have a whole lot of zamindars. You have many stories of this particular connection. And I think one of the things that we really had in mind was to try and persuade some of these families to open up some of their collections. We've been lucky in getting a lot of photographs, a lot of moral help, but the task remains to prize open many more such collections. Now, the Senis figure a lot in Birendra Kishore's imagination. We find this in two ways, and it's something that we developed in the larger exhibition. He is quite preoccupied with looking at the lineage in great detail. He's very scholarly in his approach. So he writes these lineages, corrects them, cross-checks them with oral material, looks at other. So you constantly find these lineages being perfected. So you really have in the collection the signature of a very recursive practice. I mean, here is not a man who just writes and keeps quiet. Every year or 2 years, he goes back and he thinks about it. And the collection bears that signature. So that makes the collection actually quite living. It's not something which is just collected in a fit and he's forgotten. He's constantly thinking about it. So that's something that impressed us. He is also constantly trying to integrate the teachings of the Senis within a larger, wider middle class public that is slowly tending to appropriate it on its own terms. Birendra Kishore is the one exception. He actually constantly foregrounds somebody like Dabir Khan or Sagir Khan, with whom he learned. He's always bringing them into the public forum, asking them to speak in music conferences, sharing their values with a larger audience, and in a sense, therefore, signaling to this what I call a shared Indo-Islamic legacy of music. So I felt that it was very important for me to keep talking about the Senis at every point. They are in many ways forgotten, that music, we have a trace, but I think it's important for us discursively to keep thinking about this particular legacy in Bengal. Then we had several panels actually in the original exhibition. We had panels on other networks in eastern Bengal, as well as in eastern UP, in Banaras, in Betia. And thanks to the IFA, who put us in touch with another grantee, Sumitra Ranganathan, who had worked on the Betia traditions, we were able to generate 2 excellent panels on Betia. We also got clips of some of the Betia music that was generated. What kind of aesthetic values? Can we think of a new mode of listening? Can we, we talk about epistemic. Can we think of an acoustemic? I mean, can we think about how do you actually listen to something which arises out of very different contexts from what we are now used to? Because we are all, after all, participating in a very different kind of public. So I think Sumitra's inputs certainly helped us even position Birendra Kishore in the context of the developments of the 30s and the 40s. We did pay a bit of attention to his teachers for 2 reasons. One, because he's just so attached to them. Here is a man who is really deeply invested in what he has learned, and he integrates that into a very personal musicology. Musicology in India is not, is not the way you can think about in, say, Western musicology. It grows out of very hybrid roots. There are self-teaching primers, there are things like saying, there are hagiographies of gurus, and there are ways in which then you start thinking about a more formulaic musicology for a university, for a college. So the agenda for Indian musicology is actually more complex. But you find in Bengal very interesting experiments with musicology. Some who really want to keep pushing back to Natya Shastra and who bring the entire rasa theory in understanding everything about Indian music. You have others who are much more practice oriented. People who say that no, let us look at what these ustads are actually doing. How can we then take those ustadi values from practice and integrate them into some kind of theoretical language? So in Bengal is actually very rich in having, Krishniah is a great example, and one of the panels had his notation in the main exhibition. So we thought we would use the panel on the teachers to suggest Birendra Kishore's musicology, which we in an occasional paper call it a very personal musicology. Not that it kept saying the Seni values are good, but how he tries to translate what he learns by illustrating instruments. I mean, his notebooks are full of fabulous drawings of the sarod, drawings of the sursringar. He's constantly thinking about how to translate what I have learned from my teacher into the actual designing of an instrument. So we felt that it was absolutely important to put a lot of emphasis on his teachers in relation to what he thought about music as an academic project, but also what he thought about music as performance, as practice more than performance. Then, of course, we had a number of panels on Calcutta because from the 50s, the family was more or less located in Calcutta. They lost out during the partition and really began sort of anew in the city. But what is fascinating about the story of Calcutta is, of course, the way in which music gets democratized. This is not unique as a story to Calcutta. We have it in Madras, we have it in Bombay. What is interesting, again, not exceptional, but what is interesting about Calcutta is the sheer proliferation of material. Calcutta is very well served in terms of textual material. There are really very old journals, full run. There are journals that have very detailed descriptions of the discourse. There are societies that are formed and societies that generate an archive, some of which we were able to access thanks to both Birendra Kishore and to Bimala Kanto. It's because of them that we actually managed to get several references and several collections of the journals, and then we decided to use the collections to think about this democratizing process. Two things which we wanted to highlight in this panel, there are other panels, were one, this massive expansion of concerts also brought in its wake a lot of journalistic reportage on music. So like everywhere else, you had newspapers writing about it and what good music should be. So there's a lot of debate on, should you have so many concerts? Should you have ticketed concerts? Should we go back to the better kind of mode? Is this public concert doing good for you? Then you have a lot of genuine concerns about pedagogy. How do we teach children? How do we teach women? How do we actually think about a useful primer for communicating lessons in music? There was a lot of satire. And the satires were fascinating because it was about, ustads who were somehow out of step with this new democratization, came with their big tanpuras, took hours to tune their voice to the tanpura. So there were lots of interesting satires on the ustad, also satires on the wannabe middle class woman musician who wants to become a star overnight. And so there was a way in which print and performance and image all come together to produce this really democratic understanding of music. So we really had a lot to say on Calcutta. I think if I remember right, we had 3 panels and they were very thick panels, and that was also not enough because, as I said, the material like Shurat Chanda, one of the journals, is actually quite a remarkable journal. I mean, somebody can just sit and do 50 years of that journal and you can sort of generate so many interesting subjects, papers. I'm just thinking about it as a prism to the cultural history of urban space. So it was very useful for us to think about this. The other thing that I did want to think about in democratizing in this particular panel was how music actually is speaking to the idea of a regional classical identity and to a national classical identity. So Birendra Kishore gets called by the Sangeet Natak Commission to write a history of Indian music. He speaks to the Bengal Music Conference and talks about how do we actually accelerate this process of democratization. So for me it was important because it is indicative of both a regional and a national sort of conversation as far as music is concerned. Then we decided to actually stay with what I think is the core of the collection, which was the notebooks with notations. There are, Birendra Kishore was a very systematic scholar, so he even left us an index. So the index tells you book 2 has all this, book 3 has all this, book 2 is Muhammad Ali Khan's, he's very, very detailed. And so we used that index to actually do our own catalogue because there was a ready-made index. That's when we realized that the collection is incomplete. So there were obviously, if you had 36 books, maybe 14 books had gone. So you are also conscious of in a sense, the fragmented nature of the collection. So I don't want to give the impression that we have everything, but we have a substantial amount. Now, the reason I put notations for 2 reasons. One, I really wanted to enable musicians and practitioners to use the archive. So we did not want this to be just something that some of us would talk about and we would say, yeah, we've got this great collection and go to sleep. So from the very beginning, I was absolutely insistent that we have a practitioner help us with the notebooks, and that was very, very useful. We had a young person who actually has an excellent, he put it on an Excel sheet, he classified it under ragas, under kinds of composition, under kinds of talas, and actually got metadata ready for us. And that's, we couldn't print it, it's just too long, but we have it on the, so if any of you is interested in that, you're more than welcome to look at the website. But then I also thought we could persuade our practitioner friend to use some of the notations to make music for the exhibition, and which is what he did. He taught his students to play some bits of the composition on the flute and the sarod, neither of which Birendra Kishore played, but we thought whether it could sort of make that leap, because the instrument that he played really doesn't get played very much now. And it turned out to be really, really interesting. And we felt that this was probably, for me, certainly this has been one of the most important fallouts, because a lot of musicians keep saying, yeah, we really, if we have the time, if we have some amount of energy and resources, we would like to do that, because in many ways, it's at least an attempt to grapple with an imagination of an older time. So I think that this, for me personally, this was a very rewarding part of the notation panel. The other reason I talked about notations in the main exhibition was because I wanted to re-enter the debate on notation. Constantly from the 1890s till the 1940s, there's this constant debate on whether notation is good or bad. Is Indian music, is it amenable to being notated with glides and curves? Can you really show it in notation? Is it just a memory guide, or is it something more than that? And I wanted to sort of revisit this, and I wanted to make the point that Birendra Kishore took his notations really seriously, because they are not stagnant. They are constantly being talked about. He is improving on them. He's sending them in little postcards to his students to say, try it this way. And we had this postcard collection because one of his disciples actually has this postcard collection, and she was very kind, and that was being digitized by my friend in Jaithirth University. Omlan was doing it, and so Omlan said, yeah, sure, use it for your exhibition. So that was another way we were trying to digitally integrate what there is, and this is again something I'm sharing with you. I think the whole question is not just of saying we have this and you have that, but to try and see whether we can have a consortium of practice. How is it that we can actually speak to each other and not just say, I have sound collection, you have textual collection, and we all go home happy and leave it. I mean, can we actually make this a platform to think about a new kind of public history of music? I think the sonic, I don't think the sonic has been adequately dealt with either academically or publicly. So this is something which I felt was important, so I put that notation out. And those postcards that Birendra Kishore write are moving. They are moving because here is a man who is losing his sight, but who is devoted to this practice. He's writing to all, he's getting his stenographer to write his postcards, and he's constantly saying, this is the way you practice it. You know, this is music of an order that you have no idea of. So this sort of passion, and which is not just writing, but which is constantly thinking about music, I felt was so valuable that it had to be said. And then finally, we decided to get a little extravagant and show the efflorescence of Indian music, Hindustani music in Bengal, in the domain of instrumental music, and to give a sense of the public, the musical public in Bengal, which is of course practitioners, great practitioners, you know, Nikhil, Radhika Mohan Moitra, Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar, all the greats, but also in terms of, you know, music makers, the Hiren and the Hemen shop that does the instrument, that talks to the musicians about how to fix your jawari, how to tune. So we felt that it was important to get a sense of that really efflorescent moment in Bengal, even as the Seni line disappears. You have no more Senis in terms of blood lines, you don't have them anymore. But the fact, and in a sense, these great modern musicians invented their own idiom. You know, they invented their idiom and they were incredibly popular and they were exceptional musicians. But we wanted to sort of put this Seni history into perspective and also think about this real moment of cultural freshness in Bengal in the 70s, 80s. Of course, it's a slightly different story now, you know, but that's not for something for me to comment on. But also give you a sense of the ways in which music was practiced, taught. This is actually a cowshed in which this man, Pramodanath, was actually teaching, but it also gives you a sense of a city at a particular moment, you know, and we felt that this, and of course it was great that IFA chose to support us, and we had a wonderful 3 days because we had, the exhibition was on for 15 days, but we had 3 live performances which went with the exhibition, and we actually had a seminar which was part of the exhibition, which was about archiving music and writing music. What are the challenges? So really this was, for us, I think one of the most fulfilling exercises to do. So, you know, can't say how thankful I am to IFA for it. So please. Okay.